That room still appears vividly in my memory, the scent of wine mixed with hydrangeas, the clinking of glasses, and the shimmer of the crystal lights falling on my sister's white dress as if mocking me. My mother turned to me, her face glowing, her eyes shining with pride, and she asked the same question she had used my entire life to measure my worth. Your sister's wedding was perfect. When will it be your turn, Claire? I didn't force a smile or lower my head anymore. I just looked straight at her, my lips curling into a small, harmless smile, though inside me, everything had already shifted. Soon, Mom, I said calmly. You just weren't there. The sound in the hall broke off sharply. The violin stopped, the chatter faded, and only the steady, slow beat of my own heart remained. I pulled the ring from my dress pocket, its gold glinting under the crystal light, and slipped it onto my finger, not hurried, not afraid, just quiet, as if it were something that should have been done long ago. Family ashes welcomes you. Have you ever lived your whole life trying to prove that you deserve love, even within your own family? If you have, leave a comment below. I'll read every single one, because today's story might just be yours. My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 28 and live in Seattle, a city where rain falls more often than sun and people always seem to be rushing through damp, steep streets. My father, Thomas Donovan, used to be an aerospace engineer, a strict, careful man proud of having raised two accomplished, well-behaved daughters. Every time he said that, I stayed quiet, because I knew that in his heart, the word accomplished belonged only to Alyssa, my sister. She was always the one who walked into a room and made every head turn. She smiled brightly, spoke gracefully, and knew how to make people like her. Everyone called her the jewel of the family. As for me, they said I was calm and practical, a polite way of saying unremarkable. I worked as an interior designer at a small firm downtown, a stable job, not impressive but enough to support myself. Alyssa, when she turned 16, was given a shiny silver Jeep Liberty and praised for her hard work. 3 years later, when I reached that same age, my father handed me a leather notebook and said, "You should start planning for your future." I took the gift, smiled, and when I opened it, the first page was blank. Perhaps, to them, my future wasn't worth writing yet. Alyssa had always been the center of every room she entered, even in the house we grew up in. Since childhood, she carried an ease that made people want to trust her, help her, and feel proud of her. When she decided to study economics, my parents didn't hesitate for a moment. I still remember that evening's family meeting, my father opening his laptop, reading to my mother the list of colleges Alyssa had applied to. They sat close together, discussing scholarships, dorms, bright career prospects, while I sat at the corner of the table, stirring my cold tea, listening to my mother's voice soften like she was talking about a dream. We'll take care of everything for her. Her future is worth every penny. I glanced at Alyssa, saw her eyes sparkle, and silently wondered if anyone had ever said those words about me. When it came time for me to choose a major, I said I wanted to study interior design. My mother paused and asked immediately, "Are you sure about that? Design is competitive these days. Maybe something more stable, accounting, management?" I nodded. I didn't know then that with that single question, she'd drawn an invisible line between us, one daughter destined for success, the other expected to be realistic so she won't be disappointed. There was no tuition fund for me, no apartment near campus, no savings account in my name. I worked as a barista in a small cafe in Capitol Hill, learning how to smile at customers even when my hands burned from steam and my feet ached after 8-hour shifts. I used tip money to buy paint and turn my shabby rented room into a small space where I could study. Sometimes Alyssa called to show pictures of her college life, parties, friends, a new boyfriend. My mother's face would light up every time, her voice rising as if she'd just heard of a big victory. When the call ended, she would turn to me and say half-jokingly, "You should learn to talk like your sister, dear. You're too quiet, people forget you're there." I smiled, because I didn't know how else to respond. Inside, I felt a dull, familiar ache. Maybe I really wasn't loud enough to be loved. 2 years later, when Alyssa graduated, our family threw a huge backyard party. Mom ordered a 3-tiered cake, and Dad strung lights across the trees. The whole neighborhood came. People praised her beauty, her confidence, saying she was the perfect picture of a successful American daughter. I stood by the catering table, carrying trays of desserts. Someone asked what I was doing now. I smiled and said, I'm still in school. They nodded, smiling kindly, keep it up. Your turn will come. The words were harmless, polite even, yet they struck something sharp inside my chest, as if my life were one long waiting line, and my sister would always be the one standing at the front. When Alyssa announced her engagement, the house erupted like someone had just won the lottery. Dad popped a bottle of champagne, and Mom's eyes welled with tears. She said it was the reward for a girl who's worked hard. I congratulated Alyssa with a tired smile. A few months later, when I told Mom I was seeing someone seriously, she barely looked up from polishing her wine glass and said, almost absently, you should work on yourself first, Claire. Love doesn't save anyone. I stayed silent, because I knew I was speaking to a woman who had spent her whole life believing that a person's worth was measured by degrees, appearance, and praise. But that night, when I got home and looked at myself in the mirror, I saw something different in my own eyes. They looked tired, yes, but there was also a faint spark there, something restless, something ready. I wasn't angry at my mother, and I wasn't jealous of Alyssa. It's just that every time I heard them talk about success and perfection, I felt like a rough draft, folded over so that a prettier story could be written on top of me. I still smiled, went to work, and tried to be kind. But deep down, I knew, if one day a light were ever to shine on me, it wouldn't be because someone else turned it on. It would be because I had learned how to stand in the dark long enough for my eyes to adjust. I met Ethan on a day that was utterly unremarkable, a gray Wednesday afternoon, Seattle rain sliding down bus windows in long streaks like unfinished thoughts. I was carrying color boards to the children's hospital, helping redesign the play area for long-term patients. As I set a box of paint samples down on a table, he walked in. Tall, wearing a white lab coat dusted with chalk, brown eyes warm but steady, and a voice so soft that if you weren't paying attention, you might miss his first sentence. You're the one painting the rainbow murals in the hallway, right? I looked up, surprised by the tone. It wasn't polite small talk but genuine curiosity. Yes, I said, and he smiled. I like the green near the window. The kids laugh more when they sit there. A simple comment, but it left me standing still for a long moment after he walked away. Maybe because it had been so long since anyone spoke to me with gentleness and still looked directly into my eyes. Over the next few weeks, I saw him more often. Ethan was a physical therapist, helping children regain movement after surgery. He'd often stop by my section, lingering just long enough to ask questions. What are you planning for that wall, or do you think the afternoon light's too harsh for the kids? I realized he didn't talk out of politeness. He talked because he genuinely wanted to understand. Once, I watched him sit beside a 6-year-old boy who refused to take another step. The child was on the verge of tears, shaking his head. Ethan didn't coax, didn't scold. He simply crouched down, drew a few circles on the floor with a marker, and said, "We don't have to walk fast. Let's just get to the first circle." The boy stared at him, then nodded. From a distance, my throat tightened. I don't know when we started becoming closer. Maybe it was the day he called me the woman whose eyes do the talking. I laughed and told him that was the most romantic thing anyone in a hospital had ever said to a stranger. He smiled and replied, "It's not romantic. It's just true." We began having dinner together, usually in small, quiet places where people didn't look at you to evaluate who you were with. He told me about his work, and I told him about my childhood, the endless comparisons, the birthday gift that was a blank notebook instead of a car, the constant sense of being a supporting character in my own story. Ethan never interrupted, never tried to fix it. He just listened, his hand resting lightly on the table, not touching me, but somehow steadying me. He never called me smart or beautiful. Instead, he said I was patient. He said my hands knew how to make a space feel safe for others. That simple compliment brought tears to my eyes. Maybe, in his gaze, I was finally not the other one in someone else's comparison. With him, I didn't have to prove I was worthy of love. I only had to exist, exactly as I was. Our relationship lasted 18 months, long enough for me to get used to the idea that I didn't have to protect myself anymore. We had quiet afternoons walking along Green Lake, where he always brought hot coffee because he knew I hated the bitter chill of cold brew. There were nights when I stayed late at the studio, and he'd come to pick me up, sitting on the front steps with a book in his hands. He never rushed me, just smiled when I finally walked out. We talked about small dreams. He wanted to open a rehabilitation center for disabled children, and I wanted to design homes for people rebuilding after loss. Neither of us spoke much about the distant future, but in his eyes, I could see an unspoken promise. If he believed in anything, it was me. The morning he proposed, Oregon was impossibly clear. We were on a weekend getaway, surrounded by pine trees and a lake so still it mirrored the sky. I was crouching by the water, taking pictures, when he called my name, his voice rough from the cold. When I turned, he was already on one knee, hands trembling slightly as he held out a simple gold ring, no diamond, just a thin band. "I want to build a real life with you," he said, "one that doesn't need an audience." His voice was steady, but his eyes seemed to hold the whole world. I couldn't speak, tears filled my eyes, part joy, part fear. Joy, because for the first time in my life, someone had chosen me, not out of duty or comparison. Fear, because I knew that from that moment on, I would have to face the world I had spent years trying to please. But there, in the forest, with the smell of earth and the wind rippling across the lake, I nodded. He stood up, wrapped his arms around me, and I broke down, crying not from sadness, but because, for once, I could see myself clearly in someone else's eyes. Our wedding took place on a soft April afternoon, in a lavender field on the edge of Bothell, a quiet little town less than 40 minutes from Seattle. There was no stage, no grand backdrop, no echoing music. Only the gentle wind weaving through the lavender, the golden light of late day spilling across the grass, and the sweet scent drifting through the air as if the world itself had decided to be kind. 6 of our closest friends were there, along with his parents. His mother brought a handkerchief embroidered with sparrows, telling me she'd sewn it when Ethan was a boy. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed it into mine, warm and tender. "You're the gentleness he's always needed," she said, and the words caught in my throat. We didn't hire an MC or a band. There were no scripted speeches. His father, a retired high school teacher, officiated. He read a short passage about faith and patience and love, his voice rough but steady. When Ethan turned to me, the sunlight glinting in his eyes, every bit of noise that had filled my life before seemed to dissolve. "I will love you exactly as you are," he said, "not the version others wish you to be." I don't know why those simple words made me cry, but they did. Maybe because for so long, I'd grown used to reshaping myself just to be acceptable. When he said it, I felt something inside me crack open, something light and free, as if I'd finally shed a layer I'd mistaken for my own skin. After the ceremony, we stopped with our friends at a small Italian restaurant off the highway. The tables were old wood, the yellow paint on the walls peeling in spots. The owner, an elderly Italian woman with silver hair and bright eyes, laughed when she learned we had just married and refused to take our money. "A kind love deserves celebration," she said, "even if it's just lunch." She brought out steaming plates of pasta, drizzled with olive oil, and poured us 2 glasses of red wine. We ate, we laughed, we talked about small, ordinary things. No one mentioned big weddings or family expectations. On the drive back to Seattle, the sky darkened. I leaned my head on Ethan's shoulder and listened to the soft patter of rain against the car windows. In the dim light, I looked at the ring on my hand, then quietly slid it off and threaded it through a thin silver chain, placing it around my neck. "Let's keep this just between us for a while," I whispered, almost afraid of my own voice. He nodded, squeezing my hand. The ring rested against my chest, warm and still, a secret promise between us. Something beautiful, fragile, and mine alone. I wasn't ready to share it yet, especially not with those who had taught me to believe that my happiness needed their permission. We agreed to keep it quiet, at least until Alyssa's wedding was over. The decision came easily, without long discussion. Ethan just took my hand and said, "It's okay. We have time. Not everyone needs to know right away." I nodded, feeling an odd sense of relief, as if I'd just stepped out of the path of a wave that was about to crash. Deep down, I told myself I didn't want to steal my sister's spotlight. All her life, she had been prepared for moments of admiration. I didn't want to appear as the shadow interrupting a performance already set in motion. I told Ethan it was an act of kindness, but sometimes, at night, lying in our small apartment, I could hear another voice inside me whispering the truth. It wasn't kindness. It was fear. I was afraid of the way my parents would look at me when they found out I had married without asking for permission. Afraid my mother would tell me I'd rushed into things again, that I'd made another mistake big enough for her to feel embarrassed in front of her friends. Afraid Alyssa would tilt her head, smile that gentle smile, and say, "Love's always been what you wanted most, hasn't it?" I could see it all, the frowns, the whispers over dinner, the sideways glances during family gatherings where I always sat quietly in the corner, picking at my cold salad. Maybe that's why I chose silence. I told myself it was to protect them, but the truth was, I was protecting myself from being diminished one more time. At work, I still tucked the ring under my blouse, touching it now and then as if to remind myself that my love existed, even if no one saw it. Ethan never asked why I wanted to keep it secret for so long. He understood. Some things aren't hidden out of shame, but because you're not yet strong enough to endure what happens when they're exposed. Sometimes I imagined the day I would finally tell them, how their faces would look, how their voices would rise, the judgment that would fill the room, and then I'd ask myself if I truly wanted that day to come. The answer always arrived slowly, but it was always the same, not yet. I wasn't ready. I needed a little more time to keep the fragile piece from being swept away. I knew the storm would come, I just didn't know when. And I was like someone standing at the edge of the sea, staring at the calm water, afraid and unable to look away. As Alyssa began counting down to her wedding, my parents' house turned into a command center. My mother, Evelyn, became the general, directing every detail, from the shade of the table linens to the exact curve of the chair bows. She had a thick notebook, filled with handwritten lists, vendor names, phone numbers, delivery schedules. I don't know when I officially became her unpaid assistant. I only remember that every evening when I stopped by, there was already a neatly folded to-do list waiting on the kitchen counter next to her teacup. Bring the dress to the tailor tomorrow, or call the printer, ask them to change the font to something more elegant. Every order came disguised in the same phrase, "Can you help me with this, dear?" Alyssa, meanwhile, did what brides do. She glowed. She had nothing to worry about except trying on dresses, picking flowers, chatting with photographers. I watched her, not jealous, but with a slow, quiet sadness that spread through me like ink in water. Sometimes I thought maybe being a bride in our family was less about love and more about being crowned. Whoever held the title automatically became the center of everyone's attention. 3 days before the wedding, while I was preparing for a presentation at work, my phone buzzed nonstop. Mom flashed across the screen. I answered, and before I could even say hello, her voice came sharp and hurried. "The flowers are wrong, you need to go to the shop right now." I looked at the clock. 7 a.m. I'm at the office, Mom. "I have a meeting at 8, I said, trying to stay calm. There was a pause, then she replied, clipped but firm, "Your sister's under a lot of stress. Don't make things more complicated." Her tone was soft in words, hard in meaning, leaving no room for refusal. I exhaled, hung up, packed my bag, and quietly drove toward the flower shop. I didn't turn on the radio. The early June air was cool, carrying the damp scent of last night's rain through the cracked window. My fingers brushed against the chain beneath my collar, feeling the small circle of metal warm against my skin. Every time it moved with my heartbeat, it reminded me that I was living 2 lives, one private, quiet, tender, with Ethan, and another where I still had to play the obedient daughter, the one who handled everything but was never truly seen. When I arrived at the flower shop, the florists were in a small panic, debating between 2 shades, blush pink or dusty rose. I stood there for nearly an hour, listening to them argue about undertones, hue balance, and lighting, before finally choosing the one my mother preferred, even though to me, it looked lifeless, drained of warmth or soul. On the drive back, I pulled over by the lake. The air smelled faintly of rain, and I rolled down the window, letting the wind rush in. I slipped the chain from around my neck and held the ring in my palm, its faint glimmer catching what little sunlight filtered through the clouds. In that moment, I could see it clearly. My life split into 2 rivers, one loud, full of expectations and obligations, the other quiet, narrow, flowing somewhere unseen. And I knew someday, they would meet again, collide, and create a wave I could no longer avoid. The rehearsal dinner was held at a lakeside restaurant, its chandeliers casting reflections on the water that made everything look polished, distant, almost like a dream that didn't belong to me. The long table was covered with white linen, rows of wine glasses lined up perfectly, and laughter echoing endlessly from both families. I sat at the far end of the table, quietly sipping water, keeping my smile steady so no one would notice that I was simply background decoration to someone else's happiness. Alyssa sat in the center, glowing like a star, showered with compliments about her dress, her smile, how she was born to be a bride. My mother sat beside her, nodding, her eyes gleaming with pride. And me? I was mentioned only when someone needed an extra hand, passing a plate, clearing a spot. While I was straightening napkins, a soft voice spoke beside me. "You're Claire, right?" I looked up to see an elegant older woman, silver hair neatly pinned, her gaze bright but kind. She smiled, not the polite kind, but genuine, unjudging. "I'm Margaret Green," she said. "Marcus's mother." I nodded politely. She leaned closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "Ethan's told me so much about you. You two suit each other." I froze, my heart pounding. My fingers tightened around the glass in my hand to steady the tremor. How did she know? What had Ethan said? We had never told anyone, not once admitted that we were already married. For a split second, fear shot through me. The tiny secret I'd guarded so carefully suddenly felt fragile, exposed, hanging in the air among people I had tried so hard to keep it from. But then Mrs. Green smiled again, her eyes softening into something warmer than reassurance. "Don't be afraid of loving quietly, dear," she said gently. "Sometimes, the truest love doesn't need an audience." I looked at her, unable to speak. Her words slipped into me like sunlight through winter clouds, thin but tender, enough to thaw something deep inside. I bit my lip, blinked hard to keep tears from spilling, and nodded instead of saying thank you. In that crowded room filled with hollow laughter, a stranger had seen me more clearly than my own family ever had. When she rose to join her husband, I stayed seated, hands clasped in my lap, trembling with a feeling I couldn't quite name, part relief, part ache. Maybe I had never needed the world's validation. Maybe all I ever needed was a single, steady gaze like hers, someone who saw me without me having to explain. Alyssa's wedding took place at a luxury hotel on the edge of Lake Union, where the lights shimmered over the water like 1,000 artificial stars. Everything was perfect, exactly the way my mother had always imagined, towering floral arches, cream-colored linens, a live jazz band playing old love songs, and a guest list curated to impress. I had been there since early morning, running errands with the bridesmaids, fixing place cards, adjusting chairs, making sure Alyssa's hair stayed smooth even as the wind teased a few stray strands. When the ceremony began, I stood behind her, holding her spare bouquet, smiling at the right moments, watching the pride glowing on my parents' faces. They looked complete, as if their dream family portrait had finally come to life. I wore the champagne bridesmaid dress that matched the others, fitted at the waist, skimming the floor. Each step I took made the fabric brush softly against the marble, a small sound that reminded me of my role, the background of someone else's perfect scene. I'd played it for so long that it no longer stung. I lifted my glass when others did, smiled for the cameras, and recited the same polite lines, "You look beautiful tonight, the reception is stunning, wishing you both happiness." Every word was practiced, smooth, another coat of gloss on the mask I had worn for years. And behind that smile, I felt the quiet rhythm of my heart against the ring hidden beneath my blouse, a secret pulse reminding me that there was a version of my life no one here could touch. By the time the dinner reception began, the music had turned livelier, the lights shifting into a soft blush tone. People were dancing, clinking glasses, cheering. I sat at a table near the corner, watching the scene as if I were watching a movie whose ending I already knew. The DJ grabbed the microphone, voice booming with excitement. "All right, single ladies, gather around. It's bouquet toss time." Laughter erupted as a group of young women rushed to the dance floor, giggling, their dresses glimmering under the chandeliers. I stayed seated, content to watch from afar. But then my mother, still radiant in her deep purple gown, her eyes glinting with pride and wine, turned to me, laid a hand on my shoulder, and urged, "Go on, sweetheart. Maybe you'll get lucky and meet someone." I looked at her, at that familiar insistence in her eyes, the belief that happiness only began when you had someone standing next to you. I stood up, not because I believed her, but because I didn't want to make a scene. I walked toward the crowd, surrounded by laughter and cheers. Across the room, Alyssa stood at the center, glowing in her second wedding gown like a star on stage. She lifted the bouquet high, her back to us, the soft light bouncing off her veil. Around me, dozens of hands reached up, faces gleaming with anticipation. I caught my reflection in a glass nearby and, without thinking, smiled. This time, my smile didn't tremble. It was calm, almost serene, because I knew I was no longer someone waiting to be chosen, and my happiness didn't need an audience to exist. The music kept playing, upbeat and bright, but I couldn't really hear it. The whole room shimmered under the chandeliers, white drapes and pink ribbons draped across every corner. Alyssa stood poised in the spotlight, bouquet of white roses in hand, her smile dazzling, the room holding its breath for the moment everyone believed would bring luck to the next bride-to-be. I stood behind the line of bridesmaids, their perfume sweet and cloying, the wine in my glass catching the light like the surface of Lake Union outside, shimmering, but empty. The DJ shouted again, voice full of theatrical energy, "Are you ready, ladies?" The crowd roared. From the front table, my mother turned and looked at me, her eyes bright, lips curved in that familiar teasing smile. "Go on, Claire," she called out. "Maybe tonight's your night." I wanted to shake my head, but her gaze, half hopeful, half commanding, kept me rooted. I stepped forward, my heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet, the sound of clapping and laughter filling my ears. Alyssa raised the bouquet high, spun around, and threw it over her shoulder. The bouquet soared through the air, spinning once, its petals scattering light, and then, as if guided by something unseen, landed squarely in my hands. The room erupted in cheers. "Claire caught it," someone shouted. Applause followed, a few whistles, flashes from phones. I stood still, fingers tightening around the stems until the thorns pricked my skin. For a moment, all the noise blurred, fading into the distance, and I could hear only the sound of my heartbeat, steady, deliberate, louder than the applause. My mother made her way toward me, the hem of her gown whispering against the floor. She looked at me with that radiant, too familiar smile, the one polished to perfection, practiced over a lifetime of pretending pride was love. "When will it be your turn, Claire?" she asked. Her tone was light, but the question wasn't. It was the same one she had asked at every dinner, every holiday, every milestone, a refrain that had followed me all my life. I met her eyes and smiled, but it wasn't the old, nervous smile anymore. It was quiet. Certain. "Soon, Mom," I said slowly, each word clear. "You just weren't invited." For a second, no one understood. The laughter, the chatter, even the music, all seemed to vanish at once, sucked out of the air. I could hear the faint clink of glass from the catering table, the rustle of satin as someone turned in their seat. Every face turned toward me. Alyssa froze mid-motion, half-turned, bouquetless. My mother's smile faltered, her hand trembled around her glass. "What did you say?" she whispered, voice sharp but unsteady. I took a deep breath, feeling my chest expand, my heart pressing hard against my ribs. Then I reached into the pocket of my dress. My fingertips brushed against something cool, smooth, familiar. I pulled out my wedding ring. Under the chandelier, the gold caught a beam of light, gleaming like something newly unearthed. I slid it onto my finger, slowly, deliberately. The room stayed silent. Some people stared. Others whispered. "My wedding was in April," I said, my voice low but clear enough to reach every corner. "In a lavender garden. With someone who truly sees me." The only sound that followed was the sharp clang of metal. Someone had dropped a fork. Alyssa turned around, eyes wide, her face frozen in shock. The bouquet in my hand still smelled fresh, the scent of white roses filling the air, sweet to the point of suffocation. My mother took a half step back, her lips trembling, but no words came. My father, sitting at a table farther away, had gone red in the face, his hand gripping his wine glass so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I looked at them, and for a moment everything slowed, as if I were standing outside of the scene, watching the people who had taught me to live quietly now rendered helpless by a few simple sentences. No one spoke. I could feel the weight of dozens of stares, see the discreetly raised phones, hear the soft hum of whispers spreading like wind across a dry field. I stood there, in the middle of that glittering room, surrounded by people who had always wanted me to be proper, and for the first time in my life, I didn't need them to see me anymore. In that moment, I felt no regret. Only a strange, light sensation, as if someone had opened a window after a long, stifling storm. I had kept silent for so many years, and now that silence, breaking open, became the loudest voice I'd ever had. That night, as the hotel doors closed behind us, the music and murmurs faded away, replaced by the cold air drifting in from Lake Union. It hit my face and made me shiver even through my coat. Ethan held my hand, not tightly, just enough to remind me I wasn't alone. Our footsteps echoed softly on the stone walkway, steady and measured, as the city glowed around us, the reflections of the wedding lights still trembling on the clouds. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just breathed slowly, listening to the sound of my heels blending with the wind. We walked along the edge of the lake, where the dark water mirrored the distant city lights, looking like stars that had fallen to the earth. I wondered what was happening back in that ballroom, whether my mother was crying, Alyssa furious, my father silent with his unfinished wine, the guests whispering. But I didn't look back. I had spent too many years learning how to walk away from places that didn't want me. When we got home, I crossed the doorway and immediately caught the faint scent of lavender, the candle I used to burn whenever I missed our wedding day. The lamplight glinted off the ring on my hand, no longer hidden beneath a silver chain. I slipped off my shoes and stepped barefoot onto the cool wooden floor, feeling as though I were entering a new life. Ethan sat down on the couch, his eyes following me, saying nothing. He didn't ask, didn't try to comfort me, he just looked at me, and somehow, that look made me want to cry more than any words ever could. I sat beside him, listening to the rain beginning to fall outside the window. The first summer rain, thin, steady, like strands of silver thread stitching shut the empty spaces inside me. I don't know how long we sat like that, only that when I finally looked up, the sky beyond the window had already softened, hinting at dawn. The next morning, my phone began to vibrate at 6 o'clock, and it barely stopped after that. Messages, calls, voicemails, social media alerts, all of it came at once, flashing across the screen like a small storm contained in the palm of my hand. I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee Ethan had made growing cold between my hands, watching the notifications pile up without touching them. Finally, I pressed play on the first voicemail, from my mother. Her voice cracked through the speaker, thick with tears and fury. "You ruined your sister's special day, Claire. You embarrassed us in front of everyone. Do you have any idea how ashamed I was? People kept asking me how my daughter could do something like that. Did you even think about your sister? About anyone but yourself?" I replayed it several times, not to punish myself but to make sure I hadn't imagined it. Then came Alyssa's message, so long I had to scroll multiple times to reach the end. She wrote, "You're so small, Claire. You can't stand it when someone else is happy. You picked the one day that wasn't about you and turned it into your scene. You think you're brave? You're just selfish. Everything's always about you, isn't it?" I set the phone down on the table and took a deep breath. The words selfish, ruin, shame danced through my mind, but strangely, they didn't hurt like they used to. Maybe because, for the first time, I knew they weren't my truth anymore. My father, as I expected, didn't call. He never did. All my life, he'd spoken to me through other people, through my mother, through Alyssa, through the long silences that stretched across our dinner table. I knew exactly where he was now, sitting in his study, staring out the window into the garden, a glass of red wine in hand, thinking about the embarrassment I had caused the family. He wouldn't be angry, that wasn't his way. He would be disappointed, a disappointment so cold it burned more than fury ever could. But I also knew I no longer owed him an apology. There were no words that could fill the distance between people who had never really seen each other. The phone kept ringing. This time, Ethan reached over and switched it off. He didn't ask if I was okay, because he knew the answer wasn't simple. Instead, he placed a mug of hot coffee in front of me, the steam rising and blurring the light from the window behind him. "What do you want to do today?" he asked quietly. I looked outside, at the soft rain falling over the rooftops, and said, "Nothing. I just want to listen to the rain." He nodded and pulled a chair beside me, sitting in silence, a quiet presence, solid as a wall. I took a sip of the coffee, the bitterness spreading across my tongue, and glanced at my phone still lighting up with unread messages. I knew that on the other side of that screen was a storm waiting to swallow me whole. But strangely, inside, there was only calm. Not the empty kind, but full, like the kind that comes after a hurricane, when you stand among the wreckage and realize you're still here. I felt no guilt, no fear. Only a strange, steady peace filling each breath. I thought, maybe this is what freedom feels like, not being forgiven, but no longer needing permission to exist. By afternoon, the rain stopped. The late daylight slipped through the window, glinting off the wooden table, where droplets still clung to the glass like tiny pearls. I reached out and turned off my phone, then leaned my head on Ethan's shoulder. Outside, the city carried on with its noise and movement, but inside, I could hear my own heartbeat, quiet, even, like an old song being played again after years of silence. For the first time, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be, no longer someone's second daughter, but simply myself. 3 weeks after the chaos at the Lake Union Hotel, when gossip among relatives had begun to fade and all the embellished stories had settled like the froth on cold coffee, my mother called. Her voice was small, shaky, hoarse as if she'd been crying all night. "Claire," she said, "I want to see you. Just to talk. No blaming, I promise." On the other end, I heard her heavy breathing, each word pressed through exhaustion and shame. I didn't know why I agreed. Maybe I still had a trace of hope, that fragile, foolish hope children keep, even after being pushed to the edge of their parents' affection. We met at a small steakhouse in the old district, where the lights hung low and warm, making the air feel both cozy and suffocating. When Ethan and I walked in, my parents were already seated by the window. My mother wore a beige sweater, the collar slightly askew, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. Her face was pale, so pale I could see the veins at her temple. My father, as always, looked composed, white shirt, gray vest, back straight, expression unreadable, as if this were a business meeting, not a reunion after a family scandal. The waiter poured wine, set down the menus, and left us in a silence so thick I could hear our breathing. My mother spoke first, perhaps afraid that if she waited any longer, she'd lose her nerve. "I don't want things to end in anger," she said, her eyes glistening. "I just wanted Alyssa's wedding to be perfect, you understand? Everyone was counting on it. I didn't want anything to go wrong and ruin her day." She twisted the napkin in her hands, her voice faltering. "I didn't know you were so hurt." I looked at her, and what I felt wasn't anger or bitterness anymore, just an exhaustion that seemed to reach the marrow of my bones. I spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "And what about me, Mom? Did my day have to be ruined so hers could shine?" The question hung there like smoke. My mother froze. Her lips quivered, her eyes widened, then she looked down, avoiding mine. She didn't answer. Just breathed hard, as if each word I'd said had landed like a stone breaking the ice of a long frozen lake. My father still hadn't spoken a word. He cut into his steak with slow, deliberate motions, the knife scraping the plate with a faint metallic ring, measured, detached. I looked at him and remembered every dinner of my childhood, my mother talking endlessly while he sat in silence, rigid, letting that silence carry the weight of authority. As a child, I thought that quiet meant strength, dignity. But now, watching him, I saw it for what it was, a habit of a man too used to letting others clean up what he didn't have the courage to face. "You betrayed us," my father said quietly, not looking up from his plate. "Not because you got married, but because you disrespected your family." I smiled, not bitterly, but almost with relief. "Which family, Dad? The one that only exists when your daughters follow your script? Or the one where one child is allowed to shine, while the other is kept in the shadows to balance it out?" He finally looked up, startled. Maybe for the first time in his life, he saw that I wasn't afraid anymore. My mother placed her trembling hand on the table. I just don't want to lose you, she whispered. The words caught me off guard for a moment, soft enough to almost hurt. I took a breath and said, slowly but firmly, you can't lose me, Mom. You never really had me. You only had the version of me you wanted. The air cracked like glass under pressure. My mother broke down crying, real tears this time, uncontrollable sobs that made people at nearby tables glance over. I felt Ethan's hand find mine beneath the table, warm and steady, grounding me so I wouldn't fall apart. And suddenly, in the middle of that chaos, I realized the most important thing: my parents weren't cruel. They were weak. They'd built a perfect little wall around themselves to avoid facing guilt, mistakes, and the truth that they had always chosen favorites. They loved in their own way, a warped, fearful, selfish way. And I, for years, had been climbing that wall, desperate to reach their version of love, forgetting that on my side of it, there was a whole world waiting for me, a world where I could be seen, where I could be loved without having to earn it, without standing in someone else's light. When we left the restaurant, the Seattle sky had darkened. The wind carried the scent of rain down the narrow streets. My mother stood by the door, pulling me into a long embrace, her shoulders trembling. "I'll try to understand," she said hoarsely. I didn't answer. I just nodded. Under the soft yellow light spilling from the street lamp, I saw her face more clearly than ever, the fine lines around her eyes, the fatigue etched deep in her skin. For the first time, I realized that maybe she, too, had always been someone's daughter who never learned how to love properly. Ethan opened the car door for me, but we didn't leave right away. We sat there for a long time, the rain starting to fall again in slow, careful drops. Through the windshield, I could still see her standing under the restaurant sign, small and still, the reflection of the light flickering in her wet eyes. I exhaled, my chest heavy but light all at once. They weren't bad people. They were just afraid. And sometimes, fear can be the most merciless thing of all. That night, after the dinner full of tears and silence, Ethan and I returned to our small apartment in Capitol Hill. The Seattle rain came steady now, tapping gently against the window panes. The room glowed in the amber light of the table lamp, a warmth soft enough to blur everything together, the faint scent of wine, the rhythm of breathing, and the quiet things we didn't need to say. I sat down, unclasped the necklace I had worn for nearly 6 months, and let the small ring fall into my palm, cold, but no longer foreign. I stared at it for a long time, then slowly slid it back onto my finger, where it had always belonged. "To peace," Ethan said softly, pouring red wine into 2 small glasses. Finally. I looked at him and smiled, then raised my glass. The toast made a faint sound, barely louder than a sigh. Outside, the city shimmered in the rain, the streetlights glinting on wet pavement like thousands of silent witnesses watching as we began the next chapter of our lives. In the days that followed, I learned how to live more slowly, not out of exhaustion, but because I no longer felt the need to rush. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, sometimes stopped by the hospital where Ethan worked. That small, quiet life might once have felt empty to me, but now it felt full. 6 months later, we bought a little house in the northern suburbs of Seattle. It was pale blue, barely 900 square feet, with a backyard full of wild lavender. The scent drifted through the air whenever rain was near. I never hired anyone to mow the grass or trim the hedge. I liked the way it grew untamed, slightly messy, but real. Every Sunday morning, I sat on the porch with my coffee, listening to the rustle of leaves and thinking that maybe this was what people meant when they said peace. We built a small ritual. Every Sunday evening, friends came over for dinner. They brought wine, desserts, and stories from the past. Laughter filled our worn-out kitchen, spilling out into the garden where the string lights glowed faintly over the lavender. I'd look around the table and see honest faces, no one trying to be perfect, no one performing pride. Once Ethan joked, "If your mother saw this, she'd be shocked we can be happy without candles in the center of the table." I laughed, because he was right. We were living a life my parents could never imagine, a life without spectacle, but truer than any they'd ever planned. My family still called, sometimes. Short conversations, weather, work, polite goodbyes. I stopped waiting for more than that. Alyssa sent a Christmas card, a photo of her firstborn son. I sent one back of our lavender garden in bloom. Our exchanges were kind, but formal. The bond between us had become a quiet distance, just wide enough to keep us from hurting each other again. I used to fear silence. I thought it was punishment, proof that I wasn't worth listening to. But now, when night fell and rain began to tap gently on the roof, I felt something else. The quiet no longer pressed on me, it wrapped around me, soft and deep, like a blanket laid over the past. I realized that some relationships don't need to end with forgiveness, only with enough distance to stop the pain. I looked out the window and saw the streetlights shimmering against the raindrops like threads of silver. Ethan was clearing the table. He looked up and smiled at me. I smiled back, my fingers brushing the ring on my hand, still warm, still reminding me of all I had lost and all I had reclaimed. I no longer waited for approval. I no longer needed to be understood. Because now, silence wasn't punishment anymore. It was freedom, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't dazzle, but simply exists, steady and sure. Have you ever lived in a family where love was handed out in order of favoritism? Where one person was allowed to shine, while you were left standing in their shadow? If you have, don't stay silent. Tell your story below, I'll read every word. Because sometimes, the strongest response to coldness isn't shouting or explaining. It's living, truly, freely, until no one else gets to decide your worth but you. Family Ashes is listening, because every one of your stories deserves to be seen in the light.